The box wasn't meant to be found. It had slipped behind the radiator, wedged between a crumbling skirting board and the flaking plaster of a forgotten wall. Jack only saw it because the sunlight caught the corner of its yellowing newspaper wrap, something out of place in an otherwise empty room. Inside, a tarnished gold ring, and a note no longer than 3 words. I was ready. No name, just M. Who leaves a ring behind like that? And what were they ready for? Jack didn't believe in fate, but that morning something quietly shifted. Welcome to Echoes of Kindness. Come closer. This silence has something to say. Let's begin. Jack didn't unpack much. A kettle, a chair, a few books with cracked spines. He left most boxes sealed, stacked neatly in the corner of the lounge like they were waiting for someone braver to open them. The flat, much like him, was somewhere between abandoned and unfinished. He wasn't running from anything. Not exactly. But he wasn't chasing anything either. After 11 years of marriage and an equally long silence growing between him and his wife, Jack had grown used to quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums under your skin, pressing against the things you no longer say. When the divorce papers arrived, there were no arguments, no shouting, just 2 signatures in a quiet agreement to unmake a life together. People said he took it well. Jack nodded, smiled, fixed a broken door handle in the hallway. That was his way. He fixed things. Loose hinges, dripping taps, flickering bulbs, anything mechanical, anything simple. The logic of repairs made sense to him. A stripped screw, a rusted washer, problems with names and solutions. But what do you do with something like a ring wrapped in newspaper? Or a note that says I was ready? He tried to ignore it, left it on the windowsill where dust might claim it again. But each time he passed, it seemed to look back at him. Quiet, patient, as if waiting for its meaning to be understood. And that unsettled him, because Jack knew what it felt like to leave words unsaid. He had lived inside the silence of it for years. The flat was on the edge of Brighton, tucked away on a cul-de-sac where the street lamps flickered even when they were new. There were no nosy neighbors, no children playing in the yard, no one knocking to ask if he was settling in. It was, in every way, perfect for disappearing. And yet, for all the stillness, the flat had a kind of memory. The radiator he'd pulled away from the wall still bore the outline of a once tidy square, perhaps where a photo frame had hung. On the windowsill, faint water stains shaped like flower pots. Someone had lived here fully, before time curled their traces into dust. Jack noticed these things, not because he was sentimental, but because his eyes were trained to see what didn't quite fit. It's why he'd spotted the corner of the box to begin with, and it's why the ring refused to let him be. At night, the floorboards creaked under his steps like voices learning to speak again. He began to wonder who was M, what had she been ready for, and why did it feel like that message wasn't just hers? He never said it aloud, of course. Jack wasn't the sort to speak to himself or to ghosts, but something inside him, something long folded and put away, began to lean forward. Perhaps it was the simple handwriting, the tremble in the ink, or maybe it was the way the ring didn't shine like new jewelry but dulled like it had waited a long time. Whatever it was, Jack felt it pressed gently at the edges of his quiet, not loud, not urgent, just persistent. There are men who leave, and men who stay but vanish anyway. Jack had become the second kind, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, out of forgetting how to be known. And maybe, just maybe, he was tired of that too. For 3 days, Jack tried to ignore the ring. He buried himself in small tasks, scrubbing paint off old hinges, replacing brittle caulk along the window frame. He even spent an entire afternoon quietly oiling the locks, though no one ever came through the door. But every time he passed the sill, the ring was still there, quiet, as if it didn't need his permission to wait. On the 4th morning it rained, a dull gray drizzle that seemed to soften the whole street. The sound of it tapping the windows gave the flat a strangely tender quality, like the kind of weather meant for memory. That's when he gave in. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just a quiet moment where curiosity became heavier than indifference. Jack slipped the note back into his coat pocket and walked down to the high street, hands buried in his sleeves. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, Perhaps a charity shop where he might ask about old residents, or a post office still holding forgotten letters. But instead, he ended up outside the local library. He hadn't been inside a library in years. It smelled of dust and damp carpet, and something else, paper warmed by time. The woman behind the desk looked up, her hair pinned back with a pencil, eyes sharp despite her age. Jack hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I've just moved into number 14, Everly Close. I was wondering if anyone knew who lived there before me." The woman paused, then nodded slowly. "Number 14, that would have been Margaret's place." Jack blinked. "Do you know her?" She gave a small smile, not quite sadness, not quite fondness. Everyone knew Margaret. Quiet woman, kind if you ever spoke to her, lived alone, never married. She passed, must be 3, 4 years ago now. Jack hesitated, fingers brushing the note in his pocket. "Do you know if she had any family?" "None that we knew of, but she was here often." The woman gestured to a small archive cabinet by the far wall. She loved the old classifieds, said they were the only place real feelings ever slipped through. Jack crossed the room and opened the drawer. Yellowed pages met his hands, the print blurred in places where ink had bled with age. He sifted slowly, week by week, year by year, until a clipped section caught his eye. It was small, barely a few lines. "To the man who never came. I kept the dress anyway." M. His breath caught. It wasn't the words that stunned him. It was the ache behind them. The absence so gently described, so openly lived with. Something inside him shifted. Not sharply, but like wood swelling under slow rain. A soft pressure, expanding quietly, unavoidably. When he left the library, the rain had stopped, but Jack didn't go home. He walked instead without purpose until he found himself outside a small cafe he'd passed before but never entered. Inside, a low murmur of conversation drifted between chipped saucers and steam. Elderly regulars sat in their usual places, coats draped over the backs of chairs, voices seasoned by familiarity. Jack ordered tea and sat near the window. For a while he said nothing. Then, without quite knowing why, he reached into his coat and placed the note on the table beside him. An older woman, her eyes the pale blue of winter skies, glanced at the paper as she passed. She paused. "That handwriting," she said almost to herself, "that's Margaret's." Jack looked up, surprised. "You knew her?" The woman nodded and eased herself into the chair opposite him. "She was my friend. Well, perhaps more like someone I admired quietly. She never said much, but when she did, it mattered." Jack hesitated. "Do you know anything about this note?" The woman looked at it again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up, then gently set it back down. "There was a man, Harry, met him in 74, I think. He was stationed near Brighton. They were good together, the kind of quiet love that doesn't ask to be noticed. But then he was deployed, said he'd write, said he'd return." She paused. "He never did." Jack leaned back slightly, the chair creaking beneath him. "She waited?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The woman nodded. "For years, I remember she even bought a dress, said she wanted to be ready, just in case." Jack looked down at the note again. The words now felt heavier. Not just loss, but longing left open-ended, like a door never properly closed. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the ring. It caught the weak light with a dull glow. The woman stared for a long time. That was hers. She used to wear it on a chain around her neck. Said she'd give it to him when he came back. I suppose she thought maybe he'd ask. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe noise blurred behind the weight of something too fragile for words. "I don't think he ever knew," she added softly. Jack nodded, fingers curled around the ring. That evening, when he returned home, the silence felt different. Not empty, just waiting. And that's the thing about a single, unexpected note behind a radiator. It doesn't just belong to the person who wrote it. Sometimes it belongs to the one who finds it, because they're the only one left to carry it forward. Jack didn't sleep much after that evening at the cafe, not for any dramatic reason. No haunting dreams or sudden grief. Just a quiet stirring, like a room you thought was empty turning out to have someone sitting silently in the corner. The kind of presence you don't see but somehow feel. He kept thinking about the dress, the one Margaret had bought and never worn. It wasn't the garment itself that stayed with him. It was the gesture, the choice to be ready, to wait, even when waiting offered nothing in return. He'd never known that kind of hope. Or if he had, it had long since rusted over. The next morning, he found himself back at the cafe. He didn't plan it. His legs just took him there. Elsie, the woman from the day before, was already seated, reading the paper through a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. She looked up and gave him a quiet smile. "Didn't think you'd come back." "I wasn't sure I would," Jack replied, sitting across from her again. "But I kept thinking about what you said." Elsie folded her paper. "About Margaret." He nodded. "About how long she waited, about how certain she must have been." Elsie's gaze softened. "She was, but certainty can be lonely, Jack, especially when it's not shared." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jack asked, almost reluctantly, "Did he know?" "Harry?" she said, then shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. Not fully. He wrote a few times early on. Margaret kept the letters, but then they stopped. War does that to people." Jack looked down at his hands. "And she never tried to find him?" "She did, in her own way. Sent a letter once, I think, but never heard back. After that, she stayed, planted violets, painted the flat every few years, kept the dress. She was a quiet kind of brave." That phrase stuck with him. A quiet kind of brave. Jack didn't feel brave. He felt broken in manageable pieces. The kind that didn't make a scene, just rearranged themselves silently around the missing bits. The following week, Jack began noticing things he hadn't before. The postman who always lingered slightly at number 12, chatting to the elderly woman with the garden full of wind chimes. The boy next door who kicked his football too hard, then apologized without being told. The way the wind rustled through the narrow alley beside the building, carrying smells from someone's forgotten dinner. The world had gone on while he'd shut himself away. One morning, he opened the last of the moving boxes, not because he needed what was inside, but because something in him was ready to stop pretending he wasn't still here. Inside, he found a photograph he hadn't remembered packing. It was from years ago, before the silence had grown too wide between him and his wife. They were laughing. Jack was fixing a cupboard hinge. She was holding a screwdriver the wrong way up. He didn't cry, but he sat down. That evening, he returned to the cafe again. This time with something in his coat pocket. Margaret's note, folded and unfolded so many times the crease had begun to tear. Elsie was already waiting. "I was wondering," Jack began carefully, "if anyone ever came for her funeral." "Just me and the landlord," Elsie said gently. He didn't even know her first name until the paperwork. "She left no family?" "Only that flat and a box of old belongings, mostly letters, a small record player, a pair of gloves no one wanted." Jack leaned forward. "Do you still have them?" Elsie blinked, surprised. I think the landlord kept them in the storage basement." "Why?" He hesitated. "I just think maybe someone should care." It took some convincing, and a key borrowed from a man who barely remembered Margaret. But 2 days later, Jack and Elsie descended into the dim, dust-heavy basement beneath the building. It was colder than he expected. The kind of cold that feels like it doesn't just live in the air, but in the walls. In the far corner, behind stacked chairs and broken lamps, was a weathered box marked M. Clark. Elsie opened it slowly, like a ceremony. Inside were items so ordinary they hurt. A pair of gardening gloves still stained with soil, a packet of lavender seeds, 3 vinyl records with the corners bent, and then, folded beneath an old jumper, was the dress. It was cream-colored, modest, timeless. The kind of dress not meant to dazzle, but to wade in, softly, patiently. Jack stared at it for a long time. Then he reached inside the box and pulled out a thin envelope, yellowed and unsealed. Inside, a letter. "Harry, if you find this one day, somehow, I want you to know I was ready. I always was, even when I said I wasn't. I kept the dress. I kept the little space by the radiator warm, just in case. I'm not angry. I never was, but I couldn't wait forever. So if you do come, even late, please know I would have said yes." Jack folded the letter carefully, his chest tightening in that painful, quiet way grief sometimes chooses to enter. Not like a flood, but like a forgotten song on the radio. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window watching the street lamps flicker on. He thought about Margaret, about the years she must have spent watering violets and imagining footsteps that never came. And he thought about himself, about how long he had waited. Not for anyone in particular, but for the pain to stop mattering, for the silence to feel like peace, not punishment. But perhaps silence, like love, was only ever meant to be shared. That weekend, Jack returned to the florist's and bought a small pot of violets. He placed them on his own windowsill, where the ring used to sit. The flat still creaked, the radiator still rattled when it warmed. But now it felt less like a hiding place and more like a witness to love that waited, to people who were ready, to words never said, and the quiet, aching weight of them. And though Jack didn't know it yet, he had begun to carry Margaret's story. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because something in him had always known what it was to wait behind silence, hoping someone would still hear. It was the first Sunday in weeks that didn't begin with rain. Sunlight spread gently across the wooden floor of Jack's flat, catching in the specks of dust that danced lazily through the air. The violets on the windowsill had bloomed overnight, small, fragile things, but stubborn in their color. Jack watched them for a moment before reaching for his coat. He hadn't planned on doing anything that day, but something inside him stirred with quiet insistence. He returned to the cafe just after midday. Elsie was there, her coat draped over the back of her chair, a half-finished crossword in front of her. She looked up as he approached. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, a smile brushing her lips. Jack sat down slowly. "I've been thinking about the letter and the dress and what to do with all of it." Elsie folded her hands. "Sometimes the past just wants to be remembered, not fixed." Jack nodded, but his brows stayed furrowed. "But what if there's someone who still doesn't know? Someone who needs to?" She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Jack hesitated, then placed the letter, Margaret's letter, on the table. What if Harry never came back? Because he didn't get the chance. For the first time since they'd met, Elsie looked unsettled. Her voice dropped. "You think he died?" "Maybe, or maybe he tried, maybe he lost the letter. Maybe he came back and thought she'd moved on. Or maybe he didn't know she was waiting at all." The idea had been growing quietly in Jack for days now, like ivy creeping through cracks. It wasn't just about the romance anymore. It was about unfinished lives, about missed moments that didn't need to be lost forever. Elsie stared out the window for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she whispered, "There's one place we could try." They traveled the next morning, by train, then bus, to a care home on the outskirts of Eastbourne. It was a modest place built of red brick and ivy, with wide windows that caught the sun. Elsie had remembered something about Harry's sister, how she used to work near there, how she once mentioned a brother who had come back from overseas, older than when he left, quieter. Jack didn't expect anything, not really. He had learned, through years of disappointment, how to temper hope. But when the receptionist flipped through the records and paused, his breath caught. "There is a Harold T. living here," she said. "Would you like to meet him?" Jack looked at Elsie. She nodded. Harold was in the garden, seated in a sun-warmed wheelchair, a blanket over his knees. His hair was white, thin at the crown, but his posture still held dignity. He looked up slowly as they approached. "Mr. Turner?" Jack said carefully. Harold blinked. His eyes were clouded but clear enough to focus. "Yes." Jack held out the ring. Not the letter, not yet. Just the ring. Harold stared at it, and for a moment time folded. His voice broke. "Where did you find that?" Jack lowered himself beside the chair. "In a flat. It belonged to someone named Margaret Clark." Silence. Then Harold closed his eyes. "I waited," he whispered. "I sent the letter. I asked her to meet me, but she never came." Jack froze. "She said the same, that you never came." Harold looked up, grief softening his features. "I was discharged late. The war ended, but I was held back. She never answered my last letter. I thought she'd changed her mind." Jack finally unfolded the letter. His hands shook slightly as he passed it to Harold. The old man read it once, then again, then a third time. His lips trembled. She was ready. All this time, she was ready. There was no need for more words. They sat with him for a while. Harold spoke little, but he held the letter like something sacred. At one point, he turned to Jack and said, "I would have married her the moment I stepped off that train." Jack nodded, his voice tight. She would have said yes. They left the care home in silence, the sky now heavy with cloud. On the train back to Brighton, Elsie reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Jack's. "Thank you," she said, "for giving them their ending." Jack looked out the window. "It's not an ending. Not really. Just the rest of the truth." And in that truth, something inside him shifted. The silence he'd built his life around no longer felt protective. It felt incomplete. He thought of his ex-wife, of all the things they hadn't said. He didn't know yet what he'd do, but he knew this. Words left unsaid were a kind of exile, and he was tired of living like he didn't still care. That night, Jack returned home and placed the letter beside the violets. The ring remained in his pocket, for now. Some stories didn't need fixing, but some still needed to be heard. And perhaps, in telling hers, Jack had begun, quietly finally, to find the courage to tell his own. A week later, Jack returned to the care home, not with questions this time, but with something else entirely. Closure, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Harold had passed away 3 days after their visit. Peacefully, the nurse had said, holding Margaret's letter gently folded beneath his fingers. He hadn't had much family, but Jack was listed in the visitor book. They asked if he'd like to attend the small service. He said yes. It rained that morning, the kind of soft rain that didn't soak but lingered, like mist, like memory. Jack stood beside the modest grave, the same way he'd stood by Margaret some weeks earlier. He thought of them both, these two people who had lived their whole lives apart, yet somehow carried the shape of each other in their silence. He placed the ring between the violets he brought, laying them gently across the newly turned earth. On the walk home, Elsie didn't say much. She didn't have to. Their shared quiet was full now, not empty like before, but steady, the kind that holds meaning in the spaces between words. That night, Jack finally unpacked the last of his belongings. Among them was the photo he'd once sat staring at, the one of him and his ex-wife in the kitchen, smiling over a crooked cupboard door. He picked it up, looked at it longer this time. Then, without hesitation, he placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. The flat didn't feel like a place to hide anymore. Days passed, then weeks. One afternoon, Jack returned to the cafe and found Elsie already seated. This time, he brought something with him, a small notebook. She looked at it with curiosity. "What's that, then?" "A story," Jack said. "Well, not quite yet, but I think I want to try writing it. About Margaret and Harry, about not waiting too long." Elsie smiled, eyes soft. "You've always been writing it in your way." Jack nodded. "Maybe, but I think it's time someone else heard it. And maybe it wouldn't be perfect. Maybe some parts would remain unfinished." But Jack had learned something in the quiet, the kind of lesson that only lingers after a long silence. Some words take a lifetime to say, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth saying. He stepped outside into the fading light, the street awash in soft orange and gold. As he walked home, the violets on his windowsill caught the last of the sun. They were still blooming, still open, still waiting for nothing more than the warmth of the day. And somewhere between the memory of two lives almost joined in his own still unfolding story, Jack felt it at last. Not closure, but peace. Sometimes the quietest love leaves the loudest echoes. If this story stirred something in you, comment 1 to let Margaret and Harry's story live on in one more heart. And subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one. Welcome back to Echoes of Kindness.